All right, folks, welcome to this month's AMA, Ask Mayfield Anything. As people are joining in, I'm going to take a few moments to welcome everybody and kind of get us set up for this next hour. So I appreciate you taking time to join us. Today, we're going to talk about community considerations for microgrid enablement. I'm excited for the panel we have. This is I guess, a continuation of the conversation we had at our Education Summit back in. Really appreciate them taking extra time to talk about this. And as we're going along, I encourage people really like to get questions. Makes for a better engagement, better presentation. So as we're going along, please send your questions in. We'd love to hear from you. So using the Q&A function of the Zoom is the best way to do that. It's really the way to do that. That way we can see the questions come in. We can make sure that we're addressing them and being able to answer them. So feel free to send those in, even if it's a topic we're not talking about at the very moment. We'll try and weave all of those questions in as we're going along. So appreciate that. You see there's also a poll that got launched. And so just interested on what's driving you, what you would like to see, kind of your role and kind of, what you're looking to talk about today. So if you take a moment to fill that out as well, that's super helpful for us. And then we'll probably, Sarah, we might share some resources, things like that in the chat as well. But using the Q&A for your questions is what we're looking to do. So let's get going and do some introductions so that we can kind of set the stage. My name is Ryan Mayfield, founder of Mayfield Renewables, and this is one of the fun things that I get to do. I get to do a lot of fun things, but this is, a monthly webinar we do. I get to bring on some really smart people, some people with some great insight, talk about some really key topics for our industry. So I really enjoy doing this. We've done a number of AMAs at this point. So, happy to have you go take a look at those previous ones as well. Mayfield Renewables as a company, we are a consulting engineering firm. We work with developers and EPCs doing consulting and project engineering. That's probably first and foremost what we do. And then, so we're working on solar and solar plus storage projects in the C&I space. And microgrids are a big part of that, what we've been doing. And so this whole topic is something that is very near and dear, very applicable for what we are doing, taking some of our lessons learned and trying to help educate the industry. And education and training is another big part of what we do at Mayfield. We have a number of online courses. We have courses on our own website. We have them on some of the other uh, avenues, SEI, HeatSpring, for example. And we put out a lot of other content, code corners, and things like that. So always enjoy hearing from folks. If there's topics that you want to hear about, stuff like that, feel free to reach out and let us know. We'll have some contact info at the end of the webinar here. As I mentioned, we have three folks that we had on stage at our summit in October. And so I'm going to go through and let folks introduce themselves, just kind of so you understand.
Sounds like we lost.
I'm really thank you all for taking up a fair amount of your time to do that. Sorry. And for the folks out there, I am having some weird internet stuff today. We had a big windstorm. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, but we'll talk about that a little bit too, and energy management or management of our resources and things like that. So apologize if I stop there, but let's have you folks kind of go across the line here. Lindsey Bear, if you would just introduce yourself, Spark Northwest. Love to hear about where what you're doing and kind of what Spark Northwest is doing in this space.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsey Bear. I use she, her pronouns, and I work for an organization called Spark Northwest. Spark has been around for about 20 years in the Pacific Northwest area, doing really helping underserved communities be part of the energy transition. That could look in a variety of ways, from grant writing services to technical assistance. We do a lot to try to build capacity within the organizations and the community so they can be, their own energy champions and feel empowered to decide like what their projects look like for themselves. My background, I have an energy policy and management degree, and I spent about 5 years in the installation space of solar and residential and commercial solar and battery backup systems. Most of my work right now primarily works with tribal communities on a program called ETIP that's partnered with the National Lab of the Rockies. Lots of name changes happening lately, so apologies for that. But yeah, so a lot of that work is centered around helping end of transmission line communities either develop their strategic energy plan or do a deep dive into something really technical that they utilize the national labs to help with. And a lot of that has been microgrid development. I'd say across the board, like every tribal community, end of transmission line community that we're working with through ETIP is pretty interested in microgrid development and how to bring that to their community. So we do a lot of capacity building, a lot of workforce development and training. So yeah, it's a little bit about me. Kate, do you want to go next?
Hey, my name is Kate Pedersen. I'm the Energy Resilience Program Manager at the Washington State Department of Commerce. I run the Energy Resilience Technical Assistance Program, where we support communities across Washington State in defining what energy resilience means to them, finding energy systems that will help them meet those definitions of resilience, finding funding that will pay for those systems, and then getting those systems installed. We've been around for about 3 years now, and we're serving about 100 communities across the state, many of which are pursuing or are currently constructing microgrids for things such as resilience hubs or disaster gathering spaces to support their community when the world goes sideways. And I'll pass it on to Markus.
Thank you, Kate. And I'm Markus Virta. I'm the co-founder and managing partner here at Cascadia Renewables and Sulis Energy. Cascadia Renewables provides development services to local governments, nonprofit tribes, and utilities who are interested in owning and operating microgrids for community benefit and resilience. So we try to provide that technical assistance so that as the world changes, as climate hazards continue to propagate, we have tools to ensure that those most vulnerable in our communities are supported. And I've had very much the privilege to work with Kate, Lindsey, and the folks at Mayfield on these community kind of resilience hub projects over the last several years, and can tell you it's really meaningful work, and we're honored to do it.
Great. Thank you all. And we're all Northwest. You all, the three of you are all Washington based. I'm in Oregon. So, where we sit, we kind of have our Northwest lens, I would say. But nonetheless, I mean, this is a national audience, and this is a national, right, topic. And so we'll do our best to like not make it so centered, but of course, bringing our own experiences from that. As an engineering firm, we're doing projects across the state, or across the U.S. And so what we're seeing happening here and the lessons we're learning here are definitely applicable across other states. And so, so I really, appreciate everybody joining and taking the time. So let's jump into it, start talking about these community considerations around our microgrid enablement. And I'm just going to start off, and this is meant to be an open conversation. We've done this a few times, and so I think that we'll kind of be able to go through this. But what I think as a jumping off point, community buy-in is a big part of what we're doing, and those communities are dependent on where you're doing it. I know, Lindsey, you have a lot of experience in the tribal communities and things like that, and we have other rural communities that we're working with, Markus, and so these getting that community buy-in, and for us, what we are trying to how to best put this. There's kind of this mind shift from the PV world. So as the solar industry has been growing, we've been looking at putting kilowatt hours on the grid. We can take a PV system, we can size a PV system, put it on, we can look at the energy consumption of a site and be able to really quickly and easily, like, here's how we can offset that energy consumption. With a microgrid, it's a completely different animal. We are trying to understand how the site is using energy, when they're using it, how much at any given time. So it's a somewhat of a mind shift, and we're trying to engage the communities on this. And so this upfront goal alignment versus long-term plan. And I guess I would open it up to the group. In terms of this community buy-in, what does that mean? And I guess maybe Lindsey, I'll pull you into it first. Kind of what does the community buy-in mean from a Spark Northwest as you're working with those communities, and how does that how do you engage them, them being the community, to understand the importance of that?
Yeah. I mean, one of the easiest ways is to obviously engage an organization like Spark Northwest that's been a committed partner and a trusted partner in the area. That is a role we step into often. Like, people reach out to us and say, hey, we have a bigger development that might happen, but we know we need to engage with the community. We've heard you know them. That's obviously a delicate, process, but I think that's like a first step. It's really important to just go to the community and say, like, what are you looking for? What do you need? And as the partner, maybe it's not saying that they don't know what they want, but it's kind of looking at it critically and saying, do you need a microgrid? Do you need this? Where would you put it? And actually just engaging them with like a level of trust that you have something to learn from them, just as they have something to learn from you. When you go into these communities, it's about, like, sounds weird, but taking something from the community is like a sign of respect in a lot of tribal communities and spaces. If you accept that you can learn from them, you're saying, okay, we are on a similar level here. And, it's a sign of respect to say, like, let's make your energy system work for you. And, just as every microgrid is unique, each of these communities is unique. I have a colleague who worked in Alaska for a long time, and they have a saying up there that, if once you've worked with one tribe, you've worked with one tribe. They're all different. They're all nuanced, how their social structures work, how, approvals work. It's all nuanced. And you really have to take the time to sit down with them and, learn who they are and learn what shapes their community and try to build something that, is personal to them. So I know that might not be what some people want to hear in the construction space of slow down, but, it's really worthwhile. So I think it's really important.
Yeah, and we have that moving at the speed of trust, which is something that you had said early in our conversations, Lindsey. And so I think that to me, that's a very powerful statement, and very, like, something to really think about. And Markus, I know that as a developer, sometimes maybe you get painted with a really broad brush in terms of you're coming in, you're developing projects, and you have this mindset. Developers, I'll just kind of lump in general, kind of having this mindset of get the job done and get the project in, kind of thing. I guess I would be curious on your take on kind of this, moving at the speed of trust, this idea of the community buy-in, and as a developer, what you are doing in order to maintain that or to develop that.
Yeah, I really love this framing, and I think to borrow an analogy from auto racing, sometimes slow means fast, or fast feels slow. And I think, from our perspective, that means a couple things. You obviously want to start by really listening and understanding the perspectives of the community. That's going to be necessary when you're developing a microgrid, because it's such a flexible tool. And I think, Ryan, your lead into this was really poignant, that microgrids are really about balancing supply and demand in kind of the context of energy for the client. And what that's done for me, and I don't know if anyone else on this call who's working in microgrids feels the same way, but it's really helped align my perspective in our industry with grid operations and utilities, and that really incredibly difficult job that they have while serving communities and the people who rely on power. I think that's exciting, and could potentially be changing our industry in really great ways. So what does that mean for us when we come to a community? We try to do our homework. So we always, always, always will read the comprehensive emergency management plan, the integrated resource plan, or utility kind of planning modules for that community, any comp growth plans. And then what are the climate hazards that are impacting an area, and how do those four kind of quadrants of a community's plan that are often publicly available information color the work that we're doing. And I can tell you, if you show up into a community having read those documents, that is really helpful in how you start to engage and start to ask questions and start to listen. It doesn't mean you can't still ask questions and listen. It means you've read a public plan and it gives you the context to start the conversation, but really honing in and listening and understanding what kind of the role is of this microgrid and what resilience means to a community is something I learned from working with Kate. So I don't know, Kate, if you have any other ideas to add to that.
Thank you, Markus. And I think that one of the biggest things with community buy-in is part of it is so dependent on what the project is. I mean, if this is like a community asset that's going on a building that's going to provide a community benefit for various reasons, that's a very different project than like a utility scale microgrid or BESS system that's there for load balancing. But one of the most important things to do is to understand what the purpose of that microgrid is. Is it there for, economic reasons, or is it there for resiliency reasons? And really focusing really carefully on that goal setting. And communities have to fully understand what they're asking for, what's going on, because ultimately you as a developer or a designer are going to come in, you're going to do a job, and you're going to leave. And so making sure that buy-in, so that they know what they're getting into, they know how to use these systems, is so important. And touching on what Lindsey said, every community is unique. And so even if you've done 15 community centers across the US, a community center in Florida is very different than a community center in Kansas. And that's kind of touching upon, Markus's topic of all the hazards are different, their needs are different, their environments are different. And so it's really getting a good understanding of who you're working with, what their goals are, what their needs are. And that goes across all levels of projects, but especially when you're doing those community assets that are meant to provide some type of community benefit to the people who live in the area.
That's great. Yeah, and I think this whole thing, and we've talked about this, and I'm going to kind of I'm going to come back to that energy management plan in here in a second. And I think this second bullet point of presuming the behavior, or knowing what the want is from the community. So asking the questions is always important. And then I think Kate, in our prep sessions, talking about where to site it, and where are the people going, and just really engaging the community to understand all of that is one of the biggest important things in order to make sure we see a successful project.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at disasters, people go where they're comfortable. They don't go where we tell them. And
Right.
So trying to really understand what people do when the world goes sideways, so that you can help uplift that infrastructure versus where you want it to go.
That's great. And so I want to touch back on that emergency management plan. And I think that, for me, it's not that it was necessarily a new thing, but I think it's interesting to understand, and Kate or Markus, maybe this is, kind of geared towards you. I'm jumping to the second question here first. But yeah, is there an emergency management plan? So for folks out there, in our position as either developers, EPCs, or, trying to engage with the communities, I guess my question to you is where should we expect to find that emergency management plan? How do we get our hands on it? And what are kind of those, Markus, you said you read them all. So, what are those key pieces that we're looking for to grab out of that, to understand how are we going to help this community?
Well, they're all publicly available in documents. It depends on the time of year, of course. Emergency managers right now are working kind of 20-hour days, as Kate mentioned earlier. It's a really difficult time in the Northwest with all of the flooding that's going on. If you can ever meet your emergency manager, thank them. They're probably one of the least resourced and supported people in public government in your community, and they're doing incredibly important work. the best thing you can do is be an ally to that manager, and understand, take the time to read the plan. I found it really illuminating. My poor wife, we read, 50 or so comprehensive emergency management plans in the first 6 months of a technical assistance contract we did with Kate, and it had me up at night, really worrying and thinking, and looking at the world differently. So read the thing, front to back. What I've always found is really useful is looking at the emergency support functions list inside of that plan, which is a way that emergency managers start to organize how we respond in an emergency, and who is taking the lead in the responses. That's a helpful context for me when I'm thinking about the skill sets that I have and how I can contribute to the community in a time of need. But yeah, the top line thing and most important thing is just being aware that there is a plan, what that plan is, and who the kind of key organizations and people are associated with that plan. And I'm sure Kate can fill in far more detail.
Yeah, I didn't mention in my intro, but I'm a professionally trained emergency manager. That's the background that I have before I moved into this work. And so comprehensive emergency management plans are at many levels. Every state has a state level plan, but all counties usually have them across the country, many large cities. So there's many different levels of comprehensive emergency management plans, which is really like your emergency manager's response plan. The other one that you want to have on your radar is actually your hazard mitigation plan. So hazard mitigation plans are also kind of at those many different levels. And I would recommend you go to the lowest level possible. So if it's a city level plan, go to that level. But that's going to talk about the specific hazards that area faces. One of the things that we talk about a lot in my work is if we're going to invest a lot of money in these microgrids and in these incredibly expensive investments, maybe we don't want to put them in a flood zone. Maybe we want to prioritize putting these at a facility that is most likely to actually be safe to put this infrastructure in, or looking at, high wildfire risk areas. Because ultimately, especially if you're doing a community-based system, then people aren't going to be able to gather at a community center in a flood zone if that area floods. You want to put it at the one that they're going to gather at. And then the other thing to think about is beyond just the planning is again, going back to that community and talking to them, because bureaucrats and governments, they like to make plans, they like to do all this work, but they're really looking at it from the top down. But what happens on the ground could be very, very different than what the government thinks is going to happen. And so when we go into communities to start doing this energy resilience work, I just ask, what do you do when the power goes out? Because talking about the reality, because then they can start thinking about their short and long-term goals, like this first bullet. Because sometimes those communities figure out like, oh, I actually don't need a microgrid. I just want to save money so that I can provide more services. So then I can just put in a PV system. Or, I work with a lot of faith-based organizations. Churches are really the first to show up in disasters for immediate response and recovery. And I was working with this church, and they wanted to put in a microgrid. They wanted to provide all the services to everybody who could access them. They had a big giving hearts, and they wanted to provide this access. And their pastor was part of the conversation, and they weighed in, and they were like, whoa, wait a minute. We provide and we have committed to providing services to a large number of very vulnerable people. And we have those commitments already that we have to honor. So we may not actually be able to open our doors to everyone and do all of this stuff. And so again, it's having these conversations, grounding them in the reality of the hazards and the realities of power outages, and then thinking about who do we already serve and what are we actually trying to accomplish. There's so much of the work around the development of these microgrids that really has to you have to start with a lot of conversations and not a lot of a lot of planning, not a lot of doing and we'll touch on that later.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kate. That's good stuff. And I like is a microgrid the right solution? As people that are in this space want to believe that the microgrid is always going to be the right solution, but it might not be. There might be a better way of doing it. There might be a better way of using the resources that they have at hand, and being able to understand what that is I think really important. And that's part of this engaging the community and talking to them and keeping that conversation going on, even if they walk into it saying, this is what we've decided we want to put a microgrid in, and kind of the why and the how and who are you serving. All those are, I think, really good questions to be bringing in. All right. I want to talk a little bit about kind of what the engagement looks like. And I have a couple things thoughts and things on, especially on the O&M side. But I first want to talk about kind of these local partnerships and working with, the right, helping the communities, working with the right agencies and the right partners. I guess, Lindsey, I was going to look at you to talk about kind of these local partnerships and what does this engagement look like, and how do you I guess even start the process and start pulling the right people into the conversations.
Yeah. I mean, those local partnerships, they pop up in different areas. So it is actually like going to existing community events, finding out what is already in place that you can just go and be an actual presence there and see who those local trusted partners are. Partnering with people like Spark Northwest that have been in the area for years usually know some of those hoops that you have to jump through, and the people that you're going to really want to engage with and have conversations with. Another big piece is that, anything that's related around like education and workforce development, if it's a tribal program, engaging with like Taro is a pretty great avenue, because they might know, is there a workforce that could help, build into this project a little bit, if that's tribal. I know that's like a little nuanced and different. But a big part is just being a presence in the community. Go to a resource fair, go to an energy fair, go to a community dinner. Those trusted partners are already going to be there. Sometimes it's local utilities that they have community outreach, uh, outreach departments, and those people have really good ties to the communities a lot of time, and they're seen as a presence. So you can say like, hey, I want to do this, I'd like to partner, but what's the right way to do it? How do we engage with the community? And that's where that like moving at the speed of trust is. These aren't like quick processes. Lots of people come into a lot of these like rural, remote, island communities and say, hey, we could get you a bunch of money, but as Kate said, it's about like the long term like process. Like, you're not just going to put this in and then walk away and never come back to it. It has to be maintained. It has to be checked in on it. It's supposed to provide a safety net for the community, and it's really important that it's more of a long-term partner. But you can also maintain that through existing partnerships, like Cascadia Renewables or Spark Northwest as well. But yeah, I definitely say just that, moving at the speed of trust, knowing that like each community, it's going to be a different level and a different process.
Yeah, and I think coming into a community and saying we're going to bring you a pile of money is always going to come probably with a lot of skepticism,
Yeah.
and probably maybe a good way of creating some distrust out of the gate. And so trying to not be that be that person. um, and you talked about workforce development, and that kind of gets into O&M and things like that. And so I think that is also, from my perspective, a big part of this. I'll kind of relate a lesson learned, if you will, on an early microgrid project that we did, and it was at a facility, well documented, and the facility manager retired, left, whatever, for whatever reason, is no longer there. New person came in, and we had a phone call. It was kind of a check-in call, and it was about actually a different topic, and found out somebody new had come in, and they didn't even understand that there was a whole battery system. They kind of knew there was a battery system there, but they didn't even understand what it was doing, what it was, the function it was doing. They knew that they had a solar system up on the roof, and they were watching the kilowatt hours of that, but they didn't know a whole lot about the other stuff. So For me, I think identifying these resources for the O&M plan is where I'm going with that, and making sure that it's documented, that people understand what the system is going to be able to do, and maybe even coming in and checking in with them. And I'm not sure, the question there becomes, whose responsibility is that? And I'm going to kind of look at you, Markus, and just kind of get your opinion on that. But one of the things that kind of occurred to me was the tariff rates may have changed, the demand charge rates may have changed. So, Kate, you talked about, what are we doing this for financial reasons? Are we doing it for resiliency? Probably doing it for both. And is the system today meeting those financial goals? Should we be changing things? Should we be going and doing some settings and changing some things up? And so for me, that's part of the O&M plan. But then the question always becomes, even at this one facility where they have facility managers and they don't feel comfortable doing it. So who's going to come in and do that, I guess? And so I'm going to throw that. I know it's a little bit of a wild card. I don't think we talked about this, Markus, but I know you can handle it. So just kind of your perspective and kind of how to help them make sure that they're getting the most out of their system long term.
It's super important, and I would just back up a little bit to talk about the purpose of feasibility and engagement in creating a roadmap for a project. And I want to say this really clearly. Your confirmation bias around wanting to build a microgrid is not community engagement. It's not a community engagement strategy. And the best thing you can do for your community that you're working with is to really think hard about why not to do that project and to really try to push on those levers. And it's frankly, part of the reason we founded Cascadia Renewables, coming from the industry, is we recognized that there needed to be an entity that would spend the time and a business model that would allow us to spend the time to really think hard about how are these projects going to fail and how do we prevent them from failing. So the feasibility study in our minds is this techno-economic and community engagement roadmap for the project. Now, from an O&M perspective, you're exactly right, Ryan. That is an ongoing conversation and discussion. One of the questions that we saw in the chat here was around what the kind of cost of maintenance and operation looks like for a project per megawatt. And it feels like a cop-out to say it depends, but it absolutely depends on the scope and scale of the project. And that is an answer you should be trying, or a question you should be trying to answer in the feasibility stage. And not only O&M, but also, removal of the system, recycling, and then bringing the site back up to its kind of revitalization of the site. So I really think like the value in doing feasibility and slowing down on that front end allows you to really listen to the community and anticipate what those barriers could be, and to think through them with the community, to answer that question is like, is this worth it? Is this the right technology fit? And how does this technology last for 30 plus years in this community?
And I just wanted to jump in. I just want to push back on one thing you said, Ryan, on that communities come for both economic and resilience purposes. I don't actually think that that's the case. And you design very, very different systems if you're doing an economic reliability based system, because you're really only looking for short-term outages or for demand response or things like that. So you're only managing a couple of hours. Some of the resilience-based systems that I'm working on, they're needing 6 weeks of autonomy, because the reality is that they'll lose their power for 6 weeks. And I think that that's something that people don't think about very clearly, like a lot, when they think of rural, remote, island, inline user communities. Like, the reality for them is their power goes out for 24 to 48 hours all the time. Like, that's just the norm for them. So what we think of as resilience in maybe like an urban area, which would be 24 to 48 hours, is the day-to-day reality of some of these rural areas who are actually looking at life, death, life safety situations because they're going to lose their power for months. Not only power, but like full access. So I think that that's one of the first things I want to learn from a community is, are you looking for a system based on reliability, or are you looking for a system based in resilience? And part of that is because who they engage as their technical expert is very different depending on their system. Because some of these smaller systems could easily be designed by most solar installers or most, people who don't have to do as much in-depth technical analysis. But when we get into these large resilient systems, the effort to design these systems is vast. And then I did also want to touch on, Markus was talking about what we should be doing is figuring out how to not need these systems. Do we talk ourselves out of it? And I wanted to give an example because this is something I run into a lot within my work. We say that we're energy system agnostic. So I don't push any type of energy system onto a community. My job is to help them figure out their goals so that they can find the best system. I was working with a small for-profit general store in a very, very rural area. They're the only gas station in their community. They're like the main food provider. And they just wanted to provide reliable backup when the power goes out so that people could get a hot cup of coffee, they can continue to pump gas, that kind of stuff. Based on the funding opportunities, their only option is to put in a microgrid, which would be a $500,000+ system potentially to back up their building. When really what they need is a $30,000 generator. And so that's that confirmation bias. Like, we can't come in being like, we're going to put in a microgrid. We have to come in to, we're going to find a solution regardless if it's what we want. We have to, I tell people all the time, you got to check your bias at the door. We're here to help them and help educate them to make informed decisions. So sorry to push back on you, Ryan.
No, it's a good pushback, and I'll take it. And I think one of what I've seen is going in, and this is part of the communication, part of the process, and is, the site I was specifically talking about, it was a 2-week, they had a mandate of doing a 2-week out, being able to supply power to this facility for 2 weeks in an outage. All of us in the Northwest are familiar with Cascadia subduction, so we know what that means. For those of you not in the area, we're expecting a big, huge earthquake and power out for minimum 2 weeks in a lot of areas, and more, probably months in other areas and outlying areas. And part of that process, going through the conversation with them, that was their sole focus. And then at the end, it was like, oh, we can get some economic benefit out of this as well. Bonus, thank you. That just makes it even better. And so when I say that they can do both, that's generally what I mean. Like, there's some aspect, one's going to take priority and one has to be the focus. And so I don't think we're too far not aligned on that thought process or anything like that. But I appreciate you with the clarity and kind of those comments. So absolutely, push back all day long. So all of this is, an important part of it. And then I'm going to move us forward into this next slide so we make sure that we hit all of our topics here today. But as far as this developer perspective, and so Markus, I think you're the natural one to kind of start leading us talking about this slide and talking about the process. We have big listen there at the end, and this comprehensive engagement. And I think one of the things that we talked about in our prep sessions on this was kind of this idea of, the typical idea of that it's going to, 80% of your effort's going to be in actually doing the project, actually getting everything put in, and 20% is going to be on the planning side. Whereas if we can kind of flip that script and be really putting a lot on the planning side and understanding there's all these other things below the water here, that if you do those properly, if you get that set up right, then it's going to make the actual installation side of it go a lot smoother. So I guess it just, open the floor to you, Markus, to kind of talk about that perspective and, kind of what Cascadia is doing in order to help this process.
Yeah, I think the idea is that feasibility is your project roadmap, and it should be done always and early. to support the project. And I do think like we like to talk about the three-legged stool of feasibility at Cascadia and wanting to put equal weight and emphasis on the technical project details, the economic project details, and the community project details. I don't think you can build a really meaningful project without equal weight on those three. And I agree with you, Ryan. The economic analysis and the economic benefit associated with dispatching this BESS or this microgrid in a way that's aligned with utility constraints and utility demands is why we always go into a project having looked at the IRP, the integrated resource plan for that utility service territory. And it's Drew's asking really important questions in the chat around ownership and maintenance, and we're not giving him the answer he's looking for. I can tell you, Drew, it's some projects are smaller community resilience hubs, and that O&M contract could be, $5, $6, $7,000 a year, which could mark the project infeasible if it doesn't generate that much revenue to support it, right? And so that's part of our job on the front end is to understand what are the economic benefits, the technical benefits, and then the life-saving energy benefits of these projects for communities. And to think about, I mentioned this, I think at the Mayfield Summit, the average replacement time for failed equipment in the solar industry right now is around 2 weeks. And for life critical saving equipment and utility infrastructure, that needs to be hours, if not minutes, to support these projects. Kate said it really, really well, I think, at the Mayfield Summit that, no one's going to open up a manual to learn how to operate a microgrid in an emergency. So the best thing in our minds to start early on is that education and seeking out, talking about confirmation bias, not only seeking out the project stakeholders are really excited about supporting this project, but the folks who have real legitimate concerns. And going through an education process to Lindsey's point, I'm learning every single time I work on a microgrid in the community. That's something they're giving me. And I take that really seriously. So I want to be able to share kind of what we know and what we don't know about this technology really honestly, and understand what those priorities for the community are. So I absolutely think it's an 80-20 split. There's an incredible amount of work that goes in on the front end for the project to be successful. And boy, if you do that work and you can engage all of the right stakeholders, that's where I leave at the end of the day feeling like, gosh, there's nothing more impactful I could do in these communities. And there's this massive kind of satisfaction of doing really meaningful work for people who deserve it.
Wonderful. Kate, Lindsey, do you have anything you want to add on that in terms of that engagement? We can move into the feasibility study stuff because that was something that
I think Markus hit it well. I mean, again, it's just remembering that the more work you do up front, likely the more successful you'll be. And when you don't do enough work up front, there can be really dire consequences, meaning your project may actually get derailed by communities who have not been properly engaged. And it has negative consequences for both you and for others who are trying to do that work in the area. So it's just really important.
Yeah. The discussions are going to happen whether you're there or not. So it's better to be part of them. So, if you actually do the engagement, you get to be part of the discussion, try to add in that education so there's not a bunch of misinformation and disinformation. But, if you don't take the time, they're going to happen without you. And I guarantee you there will be some people in the community that have very strong opinions that, might not be the most informed people, but they might be the loudest. So good to be a part of the discussion.
Much easier to find scary videos of batteries gone wrong than batteries doing exactly what they're supposed to do, which is just run with no fire. But they're not going to find those videos. They're going to find the terrifying ones, which will then perpetuate fear, it's really hard to counteract fear once it's set in.
Very much so. And I mean, that's something that we're seeing as far as, even, yeah, siting of battery systems, working with communities, getting that information and cutting through the misinformation. And because, yeah, the news stories of systems gone wrong are very easy to find, and it's definitely not something that you want to see. And so being able to help the communities understand what are the real risks, and don't act like there aren't any as well, I guess, is the other part of this whole thing is recognizing that there's ways of doing things and ways of cutting corners that are going to make things worse. And so Lindsey, like you're saying, being part of that conversation, I think is just a really, really important part of it. Um, into feasibility studies. And so this is a big part of what Mayfield's doing. I know it's a big part of what Markus and Cascadia are doing. And I'm also curious, Kate and Lindsey, kind of, where you're seeing this come in and kind of the benefits from it. But from our perspective, Mayfield, we started doing feasibility studies a number of years ago. And part of it was we had people coming to us, EPCs coming to us saying, here's the system, here's the size of the battery, here's the size of the PV system. Can you put it on paper so I can build it? And then start asking questions of, well, what are you trying to do with this? What's the goal? What's the, just asking some, what I would say, relatively basic questions leads to some hard conversations between whoever sold that system and whoever's owning that system or running that system, because it may not actually be doing what they wanted. So, Markus, you mentioned feasibility early and always, definitely a mantra that we have internally as well. And I guess I talk about feasibility studies a lot, so I feel like I repeat myself a fair amount. And I would love to get, Kate and Lindsey in on this conversation as well, just because, you're not necessarily doing those, but the benefit of those and kind of, what how it's going to benefit the communities, how it's going to benefit somebody, like at the state level, emergency managers understanding what these systems are going to do, how they're going to meet different requirements. And so I know Markus and I can talk all day long about feasibility. So maybe I'll mute us for a second and open it up. I guess, Kate and Lindsey, I would love to get your perspective on, what does this look like for you? And is this a requirement? Is this something that should be a requirement? And I guess just kind of take it from there.
I mean, there are certain levels of documentation that are required if you're applying for grants, at least in the state of Washington. We have a large number of clean energy grants, some of which will fund solar and storage, microgrids, that are offered by the Department of Commerce, and they require documentation, but they don't clearly state that they need like a feasibility study. I think they should, but that's just me, Kate Pedersen, talking as a person, not necessarily as a government employee. I think that I view feasibility study as basically an insurance policy that the project is actually going to be buildable. Like you could want to put in and that it's going to work the way it does, like the way that it's planned to, that it's going to last as long in theory as the community wants it to. This is the way that you can actually design a system and ensure that it's going to do what you think it's going to do, versus let's just put in the biggest battery we can with as much PV and see what happens. Because then again, you may go into a disaster thinking you have 5 days of resilience, and then find out you actually only have 24 hours worth of resilience. And if you had done something different through the feasibility process, you may have actually been able to get that 5 days. And so I kind of look at it that feasibility is how you actually get what you want. And it's an insurance policy for those who are funding these projects, that you're funding good projects that are buildable, that are more likely to be successful.
Yeah, and I'd say from the Spark Northwest perspective, a lot of our communities are actively working on getting these completed. I think everyone saw like there was a lot of funding for installation, over the last few years, But a lot of those projects, people were scrambling to get funding, and they didn't have feasibility studies, and they didn't have strategic energy plans. And, maybe they weren't really done in the perfect way because they were just trying to secure funding and get things implemented as fast as possible. So I think from Spark Northwest perspective, now is the time to do feasibility work. While there maybe is a little bit less funding, you're a bit slowed down. You can meet with the community, gather the information they need. They get to start to feel like what level of project this is, like how many different pieces and components they have to bring in compared to I've worked in like solar installation, and you get a little bit about the roof, a little bit about the panel, their bills, and you're done. Whereas like this is so much more involved. And so I think it helps set the tone for the community of like how much work this is going to be in the collaboration. But also it helps give time for if you're in a tribal community, it gives time for like their tribal council to like review the documents, give input, see if there's anything they want to add or any considerations or worries. I've worked in a lot of like some port communities and some really rural communities, and there's this level of duality in all of these communities. They want to be innovative, but they also want to be grounded in like their culture and history of who they are. They want to grow, but they want to be safe. And your job as the developer is to ensure that probably whatever gets put in speaks to both sides of those coins, that like community, because they're going to be showing up to events and having opinions about everything. So if you design a system that speaks to both sides, or you create materials that speak to both sides and, show that you understand them, like that's going to go a really long way. So I think they're super important. Also, they're a lot easier to understand than, the plans down the road. So it's nice to kind of get that early assessment of like, okay, what are we doing here? Like it's a lot more accessible to most people.
Absolutely. And I think, Kate, you said some things really well there too. And I froze up a bit. So I think I caught most of what you said. But this idea of it kind of an insurance policy, being able to um, identify what the system is supposed to do, how it was designed. And so hopefully not in a retrospective way, but if there is the disaster and the power goes out and microgrid batteries don't last as long as they were loads added after the fact? What happened there? What was the difference? In being able to have that documentation, I think is really important. And setting those expectations. This is what we can expect out of the team. But the big part of this too is, you got to look at, again, with that Northwest lens, our winters are much different than our summers. So if you're relying on solar as that backup to charge those batteries, is our outage in the winter? Is it in the summer? What do those different times of year look like? So really helping setting those expectations, I think, is super important. Markus, I wasn't trying to like not let you talk, but go ahead, Kate.
Sorry, that's often the first question I get when I have a community that comes with one of those like rapidly put together designs that they just got from whoever would give it for them. I'm like, so these are the questions you need to ask them. Like, if you're getting 18 hours of autonomy, is that in June or is that in January? Because that's a huge difference. And that's usually the first thing that they're like, oh, wait, I don't know. And then they go ask and they're like, oh, well, this isn't what we thought. So, thanks for touching on that, because there is a huge difference.
Yes, absolutely. Markus, I'll let you, and I see a question here that I want to address, but go ahead, Markus.
Yeah, I see that too. I think the idea is that the microgrid feasibility study is providing a tremendous value to the organization that it's serving, and that should cost money. One of the big motivators for us starting Cascadia Renewables, having worked at an EPC for 15 years prior, was seeing RFPs that were underdeveloped, and projects where kind of the structural capacity wasn't there, months or even years into the project's life cycle, and now we've just wasted a whole lot of time. Same with electrical, same with potentially the community. So I think there's some real value in paying up front to try to take some of that gray area and sort it into kind of an organizational framework that helps the community understand what the risks are. and the benefits of the project. At the end of the day, the feasibility study is the best guess at how this stuff can go. And these projects might cost, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to construct. So I think it's a really reasonable and responsible use of funding up front to do that work and really think through kind of the corners of this project from your community's perspective.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point in the comments. There's a couple different comments I think alluding to the same thing. There's a price tag associated with these to do a feasibility study. To do a full in-depth feasibility study does cost, fair amount of money. And the feasibility study might come out at the end and saying it's not really feasible. And that is, I guess, a risk, but it's also that insurance policy or that ability of that's a much smaller amount of money than to go build a multi-million dollar microgrid and it still doesn't work. And so where exactly that without grants, I understand that that's difficult, especially at the community level or different nonprofit levels. And so and even quite honestly for-profit companies to put out that money to as the development process, it is difficult. So that is definitely something that is a consideration. And there is a question about, if there's resources available to conduct aspects of the feasibility studies themselves. Short of doing some, modeling and things like that, I would open that up to the panel if you all know of anything. I don't know of any like kind of PV Watts-esque type of things out there to do that. And it's just to me, it's the function of it's so complex and it's just so hard to all of the different aspects. There's the energy side, there's the power side, the production, the consumption. There's so many pieces at play. It's there's not an easy way of plugging some numbers in.
I'd love to start there. I'd be really weary of anyone offering kind of like a click button feasibility study. AI is an impressive tool, but at the end of the day, it's a tool and should not be used like an author. We really try to find excellent kind of people who are excellent in their field to work with, like Mayfield, like Spark, like Washington Commerce, who are experts at what they do. That is the best way, in our mind, to fully de-risk a project to the point where you would be able to invest hundreds, if not millions of dollars in it. So in our mind, the company that we're building at Cascadia is one that is really lean and efficient, but also is valuing the squishy human brains doing, the squishy human brain things that rely on all of that experience and knowledge from the industry and from kind of decades of engineering.
Yeah, I think it's very, very well said. Thank you, Markus. So we're getting to the top of the hour, and so I'm gonna kind of get us here wrapped up, and we'll do some outros, and we'll get you contact information here. So real quick, as we're trying to transition away, so the good conversation and having this talk about all of these different aspects, I think is an important thing. But so as we're wrapping up, just kind of folks, encourage folks on the call take at Mayfield. We have a number of courses. Happy to have you take a look at this. We're doing kind of some promos here at the end of 2025. Would love to have you take a look at those. Next month, just to give a little plug for our AMA, we're going to be talking about UL 3741, fun topic for people in the PV industry doing rooftop solar systems. So we'll have some experts to talk about that. And then in the last couple minutes here, I want to just make sure that we land on this, have people contact info. And then also we have a minute or so left, parting thoughts on this, just kind of go down the line. If you have kind of your big key takeaways. I know we didn't, really talk about key takeaways in this presentation, but yeah, what you would like to have people look at. So we'll just kind of go down the line, I guess, in terms of as we're listed here. So Lindsey, do you have any parting thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd just say, move at the speed of trust, as we talked about in the beginning, take something away from each community you learn with. And, from a developer side, you don't have to reinvent the wheel on community engagement. There are organizations, if this community that you're working with is in need of something like this, there's probably an organization like Spark Northwest nearby that works with them. Reach out to them, collaborate with them. They might have funding to help, do some of this work. They might already have done some of it. And then I'll just plug the ETIP program, the Energy there's another name change. Energy Technology Innovation Partnership Project is an NREL funded program that helps communities across the country with strategic energy planning and deep dives. And each region has a community partner like Spark Northwest. So if you're not based here, reach out to that entity that represents the region around you. And I'm sure they'd be eager to talk with you and make sure when you work with communities, you're doing it in the right way and provide any assistance they can.
Infrastructure where people already gather, don't put it where you want it to. Think of the community first, not what you want.
Perfect.
First of a kind projects are really incredible and gratifying to do. You don't have to do them alone. You can do hard things together. Find great partners.
Awesome. I like that. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for the panelists. Thank you for the audience. Really appreciate everybody's time. And yeah, thank you all. And hope this was helpful and look forward to seeing you on our next AMA.